Welcome to Content Camp.
Welcome back. We are still joined by Denver Abernathy, and we have lots more questions for him. My first question would be, you've talked so far about reading about history and how you love reading about history. Has there been a moment in history that you've loved reading about, or maybe even a book that you just couldn't put down? It was just so fascinating to you.
Yeah, there's been quite a few that I've liked over the years that I got really engrossed in. I think one topic that I read about 3 books on recently was about the rituals at Eleusis in ancient Greece, and for some reason that just really caught my attention, and I couldn't let it go. To the point of I've even tried to learn some ancient Greek, and I got into kind of reading the Bible a little bit more than normal and so forth, just because just one thing led to another, and I couldn't let that go.
What were the books about? What is, I don't know how to...
Eleusis? Is that what you said?
Eleusis.
Yeah, what is that?
It was an ancient ritual. It was a secret ritual that many... Aristotle and Plato and so forth, they all went through this ritual, and they wrote about going through the ritual, but they didn't write about the ritual itself. And to a man or woman, they all said the same thing, that ritual changed their life for the rest of their lives. It's like their life started over at that moment, and they had a new life with their eyes wide open and so forth. And so they all had such great things to say about it, but we know nothing about what happened in that ritual. And so several of the books that I read were trying to figure out, they're trying to piece together the clues of what the ritual was all about. And they all disagree. And I still don't know to this day what the ritual was, but just the fact that it existed, and not just for a little time. It was over 2,000 years that this was an uninterrupted pilgrimage that people would take. You could only do it one time in your life. And almost everybody all of the famous people we know from that era, they all went through it. So I found that very fascinating.
I do wonder, you have a wife and kids, animals, and a job. When do you find time to read?
I read or listen to audiobooks at just about all free moments. So I listen to my audiobooks anytime I'm in a car, even if it's only for a 10-minute drive. I put on my audiobook, except for when I'm taking my daughter to some sort of school event where she won't let me do that. But anytime she's not in the car, I will listen to my audiobooks. I read before bed. It's such a habit that I really have a hard time even going to sleep if I haven't read for at least a little while. On the weekends, I try to read as much of the day as I can get away with. And then if I really get engrossed in a book, I'll just steal time away here and there to read.
Have you always been just a person who wants to know more and constantly learn?
I think so. I will say I wasn't a huge reader when I was in high school. I used to, when I was a kid, I loved to read kids' books, and that was sort of how I spent a lot of my time. Once I outgrew the kids' books, I didn't really get into reading again until early college. I went probably between my freshman and sophomore year in college. I lived in Lafayette, Indiana, at my brother's apartment, and he was in Chicago at that time, so I was living there by myself. Had nothing to do, so I went to a bookstore and I found it was just a science fiction book. It was today I would just consider it a throwaway book. But I really enjoyed it, and it just turned out it was a whole series, a very long series of short books. And that over that summer, I read every one of them. I would come home from work and I would put in my microwave dinner and start reading while it cooked. And then I would just keep reading until probably an hour after I should have been in bed. And then I'd even get up in the morning and I'd read some more. And I did that the whole summer. And by the time the summer was finished, I was hooked on reading again. And then it was really hard for me to get back into school because all of those readings, I have a lot harder time reading what somebody's forcing me to read or what somebody else tells me what to read. So I couldn't wait till breaks to where I could actually read. And it was probably another, several years before I got into actually reading nonfiction and things that what I feel like are really good for my brain.
Do you remember what the name of the sci-fi series was?
No idea.
None?
No.
Do you know how many books there were?
I think there were about 15 books.
Wow.
Okay. Who were the Abernathy boys?
The Abernathy boys were two young kids, and I can't remember their ages. I think they were growing up in Texas or Oklahoma in probably 1915 or something like that. And they decided they were going to ride their ponies, cross country. And their father, who was obviously an idiot, said, okay. And they rode their ponies with no provisions, really. They just took off. And it became a big news story along the way because people found out in Missouri or wherever they were that, hey, these two kids who are ages, I think they were something like 8 and 10, something like that, are riding by themselves across country. And so then the next town would be waiting for them and they would roll out the red carpet almost. They'd give them food and sometimes a place to sleep. They did a lot of camping, of course. Of course, they had a lot of there weren't good roads or anything back then, especially out west. And so there were a lot of places that were really dangerous, and they had to ford rivers and all of this with almost nobody who ever told them how to do any of this stuff. But they made it all the way to the East Coast. They were in a big parade, I think in Philadelphia. They made their way they got to ride an elephant, I think, for part of the way because they were celebrated. And then they got to D.C. and somebody loaned them a car to drive home. And so this 10-year-old, I think by this time 11-year-old boy, drove one of the first cars cross country. Again, no roads or very few good roads, and somehow they made it back. And so I think it's a great story about what kids can do, and I think this podcast kind of proves it. What kids can do if you give them the opportunity.
Did their horses make it the whole way?
They made all the way east. They didn't have to go back. I think they sold the horses.
That's great. I believe we have that book.
We do have that book, yes.
And it's just a coincidence that your name happens to be Abernathy?
It's very much a coincidence, but I didn't know about the Abernathy boys until just a few years ago.
Really?
I think it started making the rounds on social media, and people started sharing it with me, of course. But my brother and I, we used to ride horses when we were that age, and so we would get on our horses. Our parents were very lenient, and so we would get on our horses and ride to town, and then my parents would start getting phone calls that, do you know where your kids are? And it was out we were 10, 12 miles from home, and they had no idea because they didn't bother to ask where we were going. So,
do you think you and your brother could have made it all the way across the country on your horses?
I think we could have. My brother especially was very resilient, and he was, he could always kind of find solutions to problems, and he was a scrapper, and I think we would have made it. So we had our parents convinced when we were in our early teens, we were going to ride our bikes from Indiana to Florida. And they said no, of course. And we said, but why not? And they said no. And we said, but why not? And that happened for about 3 months. And finally, my dad said, if you can raise the money, go. So we were set. We were raising money to go get better bikes and get all the supplies we would need. And then we decided there were other things we wanted to spend the money on. So we didn't do it, which is probably for the best.
That's funny. When you're to kind of shift the conversation a little bit, when you are reading about history, I know you brought several books with you, and you were showing them to us earlier, and they were mostly historical. If you're reading about something that happened, you also mentioned that this is going to be a run-on sentence if I've ever heard one, but you've also mentioned that when you're reading, you will take something that's referenced and go read that book. But when you're reading a topic, do you also occasionally read about the same topic, but maybe from a different perspective? Like, World War I. There were lots of people fighting in that one.
I do that a lot. For instance, right now, on the topic of World War II, that's a topic that I've been interested in probably for the last 10 years or so. And I've read many books about the Allies and what they went through and what their perspective was. And then I read something on a blog somewhere that said, yeah, if you've read all this and you feels like you're kind of rehashing the same stories over and over, you should read it from the Axis powers point of view. So this year I read Mussolini's book, and I read a novel by Joseph Goebbels, and I'm reading Mein Kampf. And so I'm getting the other side of the story from kind of what led them to starting World War II. So I think that's another fascinating way to do it. For instance, I've read about American Indians from both sides. I like the stories from the Native American side more, but I have also read a lot of books about the white settlers' encounters with Indians, the survivors from kidnappings and so forth, the white survivors. Both sides are very interesting. I think when you read both sides, you realize most of these people are not villains. They're just people taking a different perspective into a situation. And of course, conflicts arose, as they always do. There's usually not one aggressor. It's usually a set of circumstances that it ended in war. And somebody won, and the winner got to write the story.
Do you see sometimes, maybe inconsistencies? I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, but if someone's like, oh, they did this to purposefully be aggressive, and then on the other side they're like, I don't know why they got so upset.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to war, especially, because there's always a winner and a loser, and the losers don't have the ability to get the story out, you see a wide range of the he said, she said deal. You see things about, that's an outright lie. That was just war propaganda. All kinds of things that happen to skew that story. The history that we have is never real. It's it's interesting, but you can't take any of it as fact because it's all embellished. It's all written by the winners. Some of it's outright lies because war propaganda, the whole point of it is to deceive people. And so the best you can do is get close by reading multiple accounts and then try to fill in the blanks.
I do have a question that I should probably know the answer to. What year were you born?
1971. Why is that relevant?
I'm leaning up to something. When was the Vietnam War?
It was from 65 to 75.
So when you're reading about the Vietnam War, is it weird to think that this is something that you lived through? You were very young, obviously, but like someday we're going to be reading about COVID and that's going to be something we lived through. Is that weird?
It's a little bit weird. I think it'll be weirder for you in COVID because you have memories of COVID. I don't have any memories. I have very few memories of even that time frame at all.
Yeah.
But I certainly don't remember that there was a war going on. But I do remember in elementary school when we talked about the Vietnam War, and our teacher said something about, well, this happened in your lifetimes. We were all flabbergasted because we knew about the Vietnam War at that point, but it seemed like such ancient history to us because we didn't have any actual memories of it. So it was interesting when we all learned that, this happened in our life. It'd be more like, maybe not 9/11 because you weren't alive then.
I was not alive.
But it was recent enough. It's probably more like that.
And, have you read about 9/11 and all everything? I mean, you were alive and, they say everybody remembers where they were.
Oh, yeah, I do remember where I was, and I remember it very vividly, as anybody who was alive, especially in America, remembers that very vividly.
Okay, out of all the things you've read, all the wars, all the events in history, what is the one thing that you've read that's really surprised you the most?
Excellent question. I think the thing that surprises me the most is how sophisticated civilizations were thousands of years ago. So, take the Greeks and the Romans, for instance, and, they weren't the oldest civilizations by any means, but they were so sophisticated that other than the technology around them, I don't think we would see any difference between those people and what we are today. Their understanding of the world was very similar to ours. They had the same struggles. They had the same politics. And, we think our politics are crazy today, but they were probably even more so back then. Your politics were almost certain to, if you were heavy into politics, it was almost certain to cost you your life someday. But so that was different. They viewed life and death differently. Life was considered pretty cheap back then. So you were always at risk. But other than that, their day-to-day lives, they were farmers and artisans and so forth. They lived like we live. But you always, in the abstract, you always just kind of think of them as very different from ourselves. Even the ancient Egyptians, their politics and, were probably more tied into religion more so than ours. But their day-to-day lives were also very much like ours. And we think of all of the things that they built, and it's like they must have been very different for going to all this effort to build these things. But we don't even know what all the purposes were for building those pyramids and all the other things that they built. But I'm always fascinated to see just how similar their day-to-day lives were to ours today.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever read anything that you just truly don't believe?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I think that's most things that if you read a lot, most of the things you come across, you'll need to have some healthy skepticism, because you just can't believe, especially, let's say, much of our history revolves around war. And war is, it's always a big event. It's always traumatic. It's always, scary for the people at the time. And there's always something to be gained. And so there's going to be lies about it. And so I read things all the time where I think, well, that's probably embellished. Even things like the 900 days that I talked about earlier. When I read that, I was traumatized for a while. That book, the descriptions of how people died was horrible. And then as I read other books after that, I started thinking, I think he might have exaggerated some of that. I think he was writing for a reason after the fact. He was trying to make a statement about the Soviet Union and kind of what the problems of the Soviet Union were. And I came to believe that maybe he embellished a little bit. It was no doubt horrible. Lots of people died. I think the numbers that we have were probably exaggerated of the number of people who died, but it was horrible nonetheless. It probably would have been a very compelling story without exaggeration, but I think he did exaggerate.
Thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure having you, and it's a very interesting conversation.
By golly, I might just go read a book.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I've enjoyed every minute of it.